Well, hello everyone. This is Sean McVeigh at the National Soil Survey Center, and I appreciate everyone joining in for this month's webinar on Farmland Protection Policy Act, Program Overview, and NRCS Responsibilities. We have a panel of 3 speakers today. Michael Robotham, Acting National Leader for Technical Soil Services, Bob Dobos, Soil Scientist on the Soil Interpretation Staff, and Mabel Kenyon, Program Analyst for the Soil Science Division. We have everyone in listen-only mode today, and we'll accept questions by the Q&A tab on your live meeting frame. You can enter 1 question at a time, and we'll take questions at the end. After your question's been addressed, we'll remove it from the queue, and you can enter another question. So you can only enter 1 question at a time unless you're really creative and you want to number them 1, 2 as part of your first submittal. With that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to our opener, Mike Robotham.
Hi everybody, good afternoon or good morning, depending on what part of the country you're in today. Thank you for joining us. For those of you who don't know, my name is Mike Robotham. I'm the National Leader for Soil Interpretations and the Acting National Leader for Technical Soil Services, wearing my TSS hat today. We're going to do a bit of a tag team presentation, so you don't have to listen to me the whole time. So I have with me here in Lincoln, Bob Dobos. Bob's one of our soil scientists on the interpretation staff. And we also have joining us from Washington, D.C., Mabel Kenyon. Mabel is on the staff there at NHQ as a program analyst and has been doing a lot of the work in getting some of the FPPA documents and website and things back in shape after things had languished for a little bit. So you'll hear from Bob and Mabel a bit later, but I'll start off with a bit of background, and without further ado, we'll get things started. And if I can figure out how to make this work, that would be even better. What we're going to talk about today, as you can see on your screen, is just a fairly brief history of what FPPA is, where does it apply, what are the requirements, including basically the who does what part, land evaluation and site assessment, often referred to as LESA. Bob's going to cover that part. Reporting requirements. Mabel's going to cover that because she's the one who's going to compile all your wonderful reports you're going to submit at the end of the year. We'll cover a few other miscellaneous issues that have popped up from questions from states, and then we'll take any questions and try to fill in any gaps that we haven't covered. So, what is the FPPA? The FPPA stands for the Farmland Protection Policy Act. The Act itself was passed in 1981, and you can read the codes. It was finally codified in law as a rule in actually 1984. The purpose of the Farmland Protection Policy Act, or FPPA, now you know why we always call it FPPA. Basically, the whole idea behind the act was that the federal government shouldn't aid in the conversion of farmland. That it was in the interest of the federal government to maintain good productive farmland in agricultural production, and that federal programs shouldn't encourage farmland to be taken out of production without a pretty good reason. It is not a regulatory program. It is a reporting mechanism. It has no teeth in that regard. We cannot stop anybody from doing something. What FPPA does is encourages people to consider alternative actions, and it assures that federal programs are compatible with state and local programs to protect farmland. So, we talk about complying with the FPPA. Well, so you ask, how does one comply with the FPPA? Well, the boilerplate's here that the FPPA applies if an activity meets 3 conditions. First off, you got to have federal money involved. It has to result in irreversible conversion of farmland, and the usual, none of the exemptions apply. And then there are obviously a couple of forms. We are the government, we've got forms. What I'll do in the next few slides is walk through all those terms in blue to give you a better idea of what they mean in the context of the FPPA. So, what's an activity? Well, activity is a pretty intuitive concept for most people, and for the purposes of FPPA, it's not all that different than what you would have thought of anyway. It's any action taken that affects farmland. Fair enough. Examples include you could build a housing development, you could build or widen a road, you could install a pipeline, you could expand a sewage treatment plant, you could develop a landfill, we could sit here for the next 20 minutes and talk about all the activities that could potentially impact farmland. So any of those are potentially subject to FPPA. Okay, well, remember, it wasn't just an activity. That activity had to meet certain conditions. Well, one of the conditions is federal funds. So, for the purposes of FPPA, federal funds are defined as money spent by a federal agency, and that's any agency on the activity. It can be anybody, and that includes us, NRCS. NRCS internal activities are subject to FPPA. We have everybody reports annually, we mentioned. And the top 4 from the last publicly available report, the 2012 report, is still working its way through the morass of DC. From the 2011 report, the big 4 were rural development, rural housing stuff, housing and urban development, again, housing developments. Department of Transportation, they're the highway guys. And EPA, and where EPA comes in, that may be the one that surprised you a bit, but a lot of urban infrastructure, particularly sewage treatment plants, some things like that, are actually supported by EPA money. Okay, the next thing the Act talks about is it talks about farmlands. And it specifically mentions 4 types of farmland. Prime farmland, unique farmland, and then state and locally important farmland. Prime farmland is a USDA classification. We do that at NRCS. You can read in great detail the definition of prime farmland. Ballpark is it's the good stuff. The shorthand definition is prime farmland is land that has the best combination of physical and chemical characteristics for producing food, feed, forage, fiber, and oilseed crops. So it's the good stuff. Unique farmlands are also a USDA national level classification, part of the soil survey. Unique farmlands are those farmlands that are identified as being important for a unique crop that's usually typically regionally important. I spent, most of you who've worked with me know I spent a long time in Hawaii and the Pacific Islands. Kona coffee, which is basically, well, Puerto Ricans grow some coffee as well, but the only coffee grown in a U.S. state, is grown on land that would never meet the definition of prime farmland. It's basically a pile of rocks. But it is unique farmland for the production of Kona coffee. And so that would be an example of unique farmland. Cranberry bogs are another one. There are scattered throughout the U.S. a number of places that are unique farmland. State and locally important farmland are, as you would surmise, a state and local designation of what the state and or the municipality or locality feels are important farmlands. The thing to know about those is that those lists of state and locally important farmland, in order to be considered for FPPA, that list must be certified by the state conservationist. If it's not certified by the state conservationist, they can list all they want, but it should not be considered for FPPA. In most states, the state conservationist will get the state technical committee to sign off on that list as well, but he or she is not required to do so. The next concept that you need to be aware of with FPPA is the idea of irreversible conversion. Again, a fairly intuitive concept. Basically, the land is no longer usable for agriculture, and the conversion is permanent. And you notice the quotes around permanent because nothing lasts forever. But the idea behind this, again, is fairly intuitive, that the land cannot be restored to agriculture for any practical purposes. It would take a lot of money, a lot of time. So, again, it's a pretty intuitive concept. Some judgment is involved. If you're installing a below-ground pipeline, that is probably not an irreversible conversion. They're going to ideally put the soil back on top of the pipeline that they took out. They're going to reseed, and there's no reason why that land shouldn't be able to return to agriculture. Other things get a little fuzzier. Strip mining, is that an irreversible conversion? If they're going to put back the topsoil and restore it, that becomes there are fuzzy situations, as you get closer to that line, it gets fuzzier and fuzzier. But keep in mind, this is not an NRCS decision. it depends on the funding agency to declare whether that conversion is reversible or irreversible. You can advise, but if they deem that conversion to be reversible, that's what it is. Now, there are two sets of exemptions to FPPA. The first type of exemptions apply to the land itself. And basically that is that some land is not considered farmland under the FPPA, even if it has agriculture on it, just to confuse the issue. Basically that can be divided into three classes, three sort of groups of land. One group is land that is already developed or irreversibly converted. That includes anything in the U.S. Census urban area maps. It includes existing infrastructure footprints like right-of-ways. The technical definition for those urban areas the second set is land already committed to urban development. The definition of already committed is any land with more than 30 structures per 40-acre area, so pretty low density. In addition, Bob will talk about the LESA later, but all land that receives a combined score of 160 points or less on LESA is deemed to be already committed. Again, whether there's ag there or not. And then the third category, which was singled out in the law for reasons that I don't quite understand, but was deemed important, is land committed to water storage. Again, that would typically fall into one of those upper two categories, but it is specifically mentioned in the Act. The activity you're doing can also be exempt, even if the land isn't. And the activity exemptions basically fall into two parts. The big one, and one that you're going to probably see most often, is construction of non-farm structures necessary to support ongoing farm operations. So in other words, if a farmer is going to build a manure storage lagoon, an access road, a storage building, etc., that is going to support the ongoing agricultural operation, that construction is not subject to FPPA, even if that building goes on prime farm. Again, a fairly intuitive concept. Makes sense. The second piece is the what we call the DOD's get out of jail free card. If the Department of Defense decides that the construction or land development is for national defense purposes, then blood on the block. So that's why we tend not to get a whole lot of requests from the DOD. Where do you find, so I just want to show you, now that we've covered the definitions, I'd just like to show you a little bit of where you can find the information. Most of you use Web Soil Survey, I'm sure. I'm confident. I hope so. There is a farmland classification report found in the Web Soil Survey. And you can identify an area of interest, and you'll get a little table. You probably can't read it very well, but you get a table that shows the map units, acreages, and their prime farmland classification. I would strongly encourage you to direct people who are asking you about FPPA and who are going to submit information to you submit FPPA, an FPPA request to you, this is the ideal thing that you can get from them because it has location, it has map units, and it makes your life a lot easier. So you probably want to familiarize yourself with this if you haven't already so that you can refer potential clients and customers to this website because it's going to make your work a lot easier. So speaking of your work, you probably want to know what that is. And so this slide provides a brief summary of what the requirements are for, first off, we'll talk about the federal agency, and then we'll talk about your responsibilities as the NRCS contact. So the first responsibility belongs with the federal agency who's funding this activity. They may have a contractor, they may have a consultant, but ultimately, so you may not get the paperwork from the Department of Transportation. You may get it from Smith & Jones Consulting, but it's still the federal agency responsibility. The first thing their consultant needs to do is follow the directions. When you look at the forms, we'll show you the forms in a bit here, they have pretty good directions in my opinion. So that's the first thing. The federal agency or their designate must submit three things. well, two things, but submit something, do something, and submit something else. They need to submit an original copy of the appropriate form. And we'll talk about which form is appropriate in a second. They must complete parts 1 and 3 of the form. And they must include appropriately scaled maps indicating where the project sites are. If they don't include those, if you don't see those three things, the form with parts 1 and 3 filled out and a map, you can send it back because they have not submitted an appropriate request. It's not your job to be snooping around and figuring out where this site is. They need to send you a georeferenced map that says where the site is. Something out of Web Soil Survey, something you can overlay in ArcGIS. You as the state level contact can be firm about that. At that point, you're going to do your part. We'll talk about that in a minute. You're going to return it to the applicant, to the agency, to their designate. They're going to fill out part 6 and 7, and then hopefully, and again, this doesn't happen near as often as it should, they are supposed to return the final form to NRCS so that we have a copy. Now, does that happen all the time? No. Does that happen some of the time? Yeah. Ask. At least ask. You can't require them to return a copy, but at least if you can remember to ask, we got a better shot than if you don't ask. So what do we have to do? According to the Act, the first thing we have to do is determine whether the site contains prime, unique, or important farmlands. Now, in practice, this first step you may have already dealt with on the phone when you were talking to these folks if they called you first, because you may have already determined whether they need to file the form or not, because if none of these are present, if no prime, unique, or important farmland is present, they don't need to file the form in the first place, and we can save everybody a lot of time. But if you do get a form, this isn't obvious, you are required to determine or to verify, maybe is a better word, that this site does contain prime, unique, or important farm. Assuming it does, and none of the exemptions apply, so FPA applies, NRCS is going to complete parts 2, 4, and 5 of the form. And we'll talk about, Bob's going to talk about the LESA, which is parts 4 and 5. Part 2 is some record-keeping information related to the amount of prime farmland in the county, amount impacted by the site. Once you do that, you're going to return the form to the applicant and keep a copy. There is a response time requirement in this legislation, and that says that we, as an agency, must respond within 10 working days. If it's a standard request, that is, all paperwork's there, good map, don't need to go on site, there's nothing strange about it. It says that we have up to 30 working days if a site visit is needed, or if no land evaluation system is present, and you have to work on developing one. However, if you're going to play the 30-day card, NRCS is required to officially inform the applicant and document that. So it's a letter, not a phone call. It's at least an email, potentially a letter, because you need that documentation as to why it's not 10 days, it's going to be 30. So what else we got? What else do you need to know? Well, you probably ask which form. There's two, right? Well, the AD 1006 is the default form. That is the standard Farmland Protection Policy Act form. A second form, the NRCS CPA-106, has been developed and is available for use with what we call corridor projects. And a corridor project is kind of just what you thought it was, something long and skinny. The corridor project definition is a site configuration connecting two distant points and crossing several different tracts of land. If you think about corridors, pretty intuitively you're talking about roads, railroads, pipelines, utility lines, something long and skinny. Data sources, again, we talked briefly about that earlier. Official soils data, SURGO data for prime and unique farmland. The EFOTG is your source for data for farmland of state and local importance. Remember, those lists need to be signed up by the state conservationist. They should be in the EFOTG. Many states have digitized this layer as a GIS layer. It's either a direct overlay of soils or they've digitized it on their own. As I mentioned, it's only legit if it's certified by the STC. And then you're going to need your state or local land evaluation values. And with that, I'm going to turn the floor over to Bob Dobos, who's going to talk about the land evaluation site assessment system. So, Bob, the floor is yours.
Okay. Thanks, Mike. Let's see here. Little arrow down there, got it. So, we've been at this for several decades, really, FPPA, so there's a good chance that your LESA system may already exist, and you just need to update it. There's lots of things that could potentially be updated, though, because of the fact that the sewer system could very well have expanded since your LESA system was originally done. Roads could well have changed. Water pipelines and things like that could also have changed, so you might need to do a little legwork there. In some areas, there might be a little more work that has to be done because the yield data has been taken out of the database, and that can be a little difficult sometimes. And also due to SDJR, as we call it, map units that you're familiar with may have been deleted from the county or other map units added to the county. And so you'd have to check pretty well to make sure that your LESA system is ready to go, or at least your land evaluation part of the system. And keep in mind that LESA is not a regulatory thing. It's a decision support tool that gives you a consistent, reproducible, and science-based way of assigning a value to land, the relative value of land. So, criteria for land evaluation. The soils of the area are evaluated on their relative productivity for locally grown crops. You can look at land capability classifications, look at important farmland maps. There's a little bit of slippage between things like land capability class and subclass and productivity rating, because those are pretty broad groups, land capability class. And the soils within the local government jurisdiction, usually a county, are examined and given a relative value score from 100 to 1, or to 0 points, really. And this goes on part 5 of the Form 1006. And we'll see a 1006 later on. So, if your county's been manipulated or whatever in the past 20 years, it could very well happen. So you need to get a land evaluation updated. The quick and dirty way, hopefully will work, is just to go to Web Soil Survey, and we'll step through this with some pictures later on, but we want to set the area of interest to the whole county. You can do that. And then once that's established, go to the Soil Data Explorer tab, and under Vegetative Productivity tab, select the appropriate yield. It could be irrigated or non-irrigated, whichever is appropriate for the county that you're in. And view the rating table, and let's go to that. It'll look like this. This is my county here. I've set the whole, that's why it's all blocked out. All the soil lines are showing up. It blinks the whole thing out. Clicked on the vegetative productivity, open that menu. Yields of non-irrigated crops, because this is out in Pennsylvania where there's not a whole lot of irrigation. And I ran on corn, which is the standard kind of crop in that part of the world. And I have a nice table. The rating is actually the bushels per acre. It's the yield for the crops in that county. And one thing's nice about these HTML things is you can highlight this with your cursor, which will look like this. Just highlight the whole table, copy, and then you you can paste that right into Excel, and it's just like that. And that's really a pretty slick thing. But right now they're all kind of in a mishmash of an order, so we can sort on the rating, which is actually the yield. So sort by crop yield, and we'll normalize the highest yield to an index of 100. What's that look like? Well, here we are sorted by yield. We can see Duffield comes out as the top dog in that county. There must be some minor components in there to get a 162.93 rating, because we don't usually measure yields quite that precisely. And you can always see that the best soils are the least extensive in a county in the east. So then we'll normalize this to 100 by a simple algebraic little equation here. We'll take the 162.93, divide it by every value into that, take it times 100, and that gives me an index. I should have had this just to integers, but you can get the point. The 800's the top dog, 84s on down to 72 down here for this rural. Then it gets lower, down to zeros for rock outcrop and things like that. So this is the best case scenario, really. It's easy way to do the land evaluation. But what if the crop yield data is not there? Then it makes a little difference. So you've gone and you've set a county to your area of interest. You click on the vegetative productivity, hit the yields of non-irrigated crops, and it says cannot run yields of non-irrigated crops. The data is not available. You see the values everything's empty. Well, most of the time, if that door has been closed, the state has a productivity index, like Iowa uses the Iowa Corn Suitability Rating. A lot of other states have productivity indices or yield estimates that they calculate. Sometimes they don't end up in web soil survey. If there's no other index available, you can use the thing called the National Commodity Crop Productivity Index. If you don't have access to that data, you can get a hold of me and I can supply you with that. And we normalize the highest index value in the county to 100. And that looks like this. So we have that particular county that we didn't have any yield data for. We have the index for corns is 0.88, so we index that to 100 by dividing all the indices by 0.88. And we get the land evaluation just like that. Next part, and that will be on the part 5 of the 10-6. I think that's right. I'll get up to that. Part 5. Yes, that's part 5. The site assessment criteria, the other federal agency works through this. And it's set out in Chapter 7 of CFR, Code of Federal Regulations. Also included in the FPPA handbook, the link to which is right here, site assessment. Again, it's a way to reproducibly and consistently rate the site assessment for a particular, so you can compare two tracts of land, or more, two or more tracts. And just each kind of these things is given a point rating. Non-urban land use, within a mile, so on, build-up area, how much land will be made non-farmable, and just a raft of criteria that are given points. And the summation here is part 6 and 7 of the AB 10-6. And sometimes a county will have a site assessment system that they decide decided, within the county how they want to rate the value of the soils or the sites. So they might have a slightly divergent system, but it's consistently applied. And here's what the form looks like. And you can see Part 1's completed by a federal agency. Part 2 is us, NRCS. Part 3 is the federal agency. Part 4 is NRCS. And Part 5. So all the blue places, it looks like kind of all the highlighted places are NRCS. And the land evaluation criteria goes right in here. And then we have the second part of it, site assessment, completed by the federal agency, and Part 6, Part 7 also completed by the federal agency. And it looks like we total 11 more points. Site assessment's 160, and the total points, decisions made based on the total points. So that's land evaluation, site assessment, and some of the responsibilities and mechanisms of how that is done. And that's all for my part today, and thank you for your attention. I'll turn it over now to Emma Bell, and she'll bring us to another part along here. How do I, does she automatically has control, so take it away.
Thanks, Bob. Okay. So, for those of you who are new to the world of FPPA and have not heard of me, well, you'll be hearing more from me when you start dealing with the CPA2 in the next few weeks. The dreaded CPA2, what is it really about, and what higher purpose does it really serve? So let's go to the next page. So this is the CPA2. The CPA2 is the FPPA Excel summary spreadsheet that we ask you every year to submit to the Soil Science Division. It comes as an attachment to the national bulletin we release annually. Actually, we just released one a few weeks ago. If you have the PDF copy of the CPA2, I'm telling you right now you have the wrong one, so you'd better email us and we'll provide you the Excel sheet. As for that higher purpose, the data that you provide in CPA2 form the backbone of the FPPA annual report that we are required to submit to Congress, specifically to the Senate Committee on Agriculture, Nutrition, and Forestry, and to the House Committee on Agriculture. The FPPA annual report includes information on the progress of federal agencies in implementing FPPA, the review and revision of federal policies and procedures affecting farmland conversion, and federal, state, and local efforts to protect farmland. Later in my presentation about the FPPA website, I will point out where you can download the annual reports. As you can see, we tried to make things a little bit easier for you. We have included automatic sums. So let me see if this works. So these are the automatic sums for cells that we show for total numbers. So we've also pre-populated the sheet with federal agencies that usually submit their 80-1006 and CPA-106 forms. And one more thing, we've locked the spreadsheet, so it requires a password to unlock it, and if you have to add another column, so you have to unlock this spreadsheet, and I'm more than willing to share that password with you when you ask for it. Moving on, I want to make your job easier, and I want to make mine easier too, so let me bring your attention to the most important fields or cells you need to fill for the purpose of the FPPA annual report. So let's see if this works. The first group consists of Section A, that section, and Section B. So I guess this works. A pertains to the number of 80-1006 and CPA-106 requests your office has received for this fiscal year. And for Section B, it asks for the number of completed 80-1006 and CPA-106 forms. So now you may be asking, what about Section C? So let me, that section there, 80-1006 and CPA-106 returned by agency. Well, Section C actually refers to the number of 801006 and CPA 106 copies returned to you after decisions were made on proposed projects by the funding federal agencies. Historically, very few agencies came back to NRCS about their final project decisions, thus we have not included this in the annual report, so we really don't consider this as an essential cell for you to fill out when you submit your CPA2 to us. So let's move on to the next important group. So let me just quickly go to that highlight again. The next important group includes 4 subsections in Section D. So let's start with D1. So this is D1. D1 provides you the total land acres proposed and the total land acres converted. D2 provides you the total important farmland acres proposed and the total important farmland acres converted. These are the cells that we have automatic sums for. So these 3 and 4, these sections here and here, disregard that 5 there. When you total them, the total should appear in this pink cells here. So you make sure that your D2, this one here, the pink one, make sure that your D2 total are less than the numbers you provided in D1 over here, this part here. In the past, we've had some CPA2s wherein you have the total land acres proposed is less than the total important farmland acres. So, intuitively, it's not correct. So there's something going on there. So I think you should check back with your figures. And if we do catch it, we usually talk to the FPPA point of contact, and then we return the CPA2 to them. Okay. So one last and very important thing. You remember in Section C that I just pointed a while ago, the number of returned and completed 801006 and CPA 106 forms by the federal agencies. If you have 0 in this cell, whether it's in the total or under the agencies, all your numbers under acres converted from D1, D2, D3, and D4 should be 0 as well. We won't know anything about the data and farmland acre conversion until you get those forms back from the federal agencies. And as I mentioned earlier, history has shown that federal agencies rarely get back to NRCS about any final project decisions. So the bottom line is, if you provide numbers or figures under acres converted, your Section C should have some numbers to back them up. So if you provide 0 here and you provide numbers under any of the acres converted, we will have to return the form back to you because something is not right there. Okay. As for the other sections that I have not really talked about, these are actually nice to have. You can choose to fill them or you can leave them blank. But if you have the information, that's fine. But right now I'm telling you, we don't, those numbers are not reflected in the annual report. That's why I didn't really talk much about them. So, as I said earlier, let's make our lives easier and just focus on this important section. So now we're going to go to the next slide. So bear with me here. We've got some technological hiccups, so I'm going to quickly skip this part. Okay, so here we go. So now we move to the website. We highly encourage you to visit the FPPA website. It has all the forms, information, and tools that you need regarding FPPA. You can download the CPA2 form. I think if I do enter, yes, there you go. From this link here, which is located at the left navigational shortcut bars. You can also get the FPPA manual here. There you go. And the annual reports down here. This is an older screenshot of the site, but you should be able to see the fiscal year 2012 FPPA annual report listed down here if you go to the website, maybe about an hour later. So here's the link to the site. And if you don't remember that link, you just go to the NRCS website, and what you do is under the Topics tab, this one here, this Topics tab here, all you have to do is choose that, and then it brings you a drop-down menu, and just choose Land Use, and in Land Use you will see the Farmland Protection Policy Act, and click on that, and you'll reach this page. But if you don't have access to the internet, you can always call Mike, Bob, or me. Make sure you save our numbers under your favorites. So this brings me to the last slide of my presentation, the most important slide actually. It's a deadline. So please submit your CPA2 to me by October 31. I know that the National Bulletin shows Maxine as the contact person since she's the current acting program manager for the division, but please make Maxine's life easier by submitting your CPA2 to me. I currently work for her anyway. So here's my email address and my phone number. Please do not hesitate to call me or email me if you have questions in CPA2. I usually respond within a few minutes after I get the email unless I'm in a meeting. So this concludes my portion of the webinar. Let me turn you over back to Mike for the last part of this webinar.
Thanks, Mabel. And I just, like I was telling the folks here in Lincoln, Mabel's fairly new to the division, and we're very, very happy to have her. She's doing great stuff, and if you have a chance to work with her on FPPA or anything else, take the chance, because she's wonderful to work with, and doing some really good stuff, and getting some things taken care of that had kind of lingered when we didn't have someone taken care of. And FPPA's been one place where she's done a lot of great work for us. Anyway, I just wanted to finish off very briefly with some other things that have come up in emails and phone calls that Annabelle and I have received over the past few months. There are several things that aren't mentioned in the statute or the rule just to make your life fun and interesting regarding FPPA. The first thing that is never explicitly mentioned is the conversion of prime farmland to non-prime farmland. FPPA talks a lot about prime farmland and preserving prime farmland, but doesn't discuss at all activities where prime farmland may be converted to non-prime farmland. So that's not something that's considered in the Act. The Act never does define what permanent or irreversible mean. We talked a bit about that earlier. Use your best judgment. Another issue that came up a bit ago was, how long are these determinations valid? You can propose something and then nothing happens for 10 years. Is the determination still legit? Again, an expiration date is never mentioned in either the law or the rule. Use your best judgment. Use some logic. Again, as Bob pointed out with land evaluation and site assessment, saying that nothing has changed regarding particularly the site assessment section after 5 or 10 years in most of the United States is probably pushing it. So, again, use your best judgment. Another issue that's come up fairly recently is an issue of minimum size. Unfortunately, a minimum size is never mentioned in the Act or the rule. Many states have informal guidelines in place about when they've just decided they're not going to worry about it. This is one, actually, we're working with Mabel and Maxine to trying to figure out who to talk to at the Office of the General Counsel. If you've never dealt with them, they're the government attorneys. And that's what they kind of do for a living, is try to answer questions like this. So we're trying to get a little better ruling on that. Additionally, you may be aware of the idea of prime and unique range and forest lands, and also range and forest lands of state and local importance. Those do exist in parts of the country. They are not covered under the FPPA. However, when you're looking at advising people on how to better manage land, remember, our goal as a federal agency is still to minimize the conversion of prime agricultural land by development. So you want to advise folks accordingly. Just want to briefly mention that NRCS activities are subject to FPPA, technically. Virtually everything is exempt under the supports existing agricultural use exemption. FPA is actually included in the CPA 52, and I'm going to be giving a brief seminar to field staff tomorrow as part of a efforts from the S&T side of the house on the CPA-52 about FPPA. FPPA could, in theory, apply to things like easements, but it's hard to see areas that you'd be putting in an easement to take out of agricultural production. Why would you be doing that if it was prime agricultural land? So it's real hard to find a scenario where an NRCS activity would be subject to FPPA. There are a few requirements of the state. Every state must have a designated lead FPPA contact. That was actually stated in the National Bulletin a couple of years back, Bulletin 310.12.2, but it's been standard practice ever since there was an FPPA. It's often the state soil scientist or the assistant state soil scientist, although others have been assigned that baton in various states, and I suspect that's your job. That's why many of you are on this teleconference, is that you are the person, or you were just told you were. There must be a procedure in place to address FPPA requests within the legislative timelines. Some states do this at the state level, some states do this at the area level, some states do it at the local level. Again, that's not specified. You need to figure out what's happening in your state and is it working. Do you need to change? That's something that you as the FPPA contact will want to discuss with appropriate other staff, your colleagues, your supervisors, etc. As Mabel mentioned, please fill out your CPA2. Mabel's really nice, but she will be very persistent about making sure you get your form in. So there are other reasons to talk to her than having to respond to her turn in your form already phone calls over the next few weeks. Again, Mabel, another plug for the website. And now we'd be happy. We're about 1:45. We just about made the time, so we have time for some questions. So I'll turn the floor over to Sean to handle that part of it.
And again, people can enter their question in the Q&A portion of the live meeting frame, and I'll open it up to questions here in the center room with me. I'm going to come up and ask a question. Today's webinar is recorded, and it'll be posted in the next few days on our NSSC YouTube channel, and that was included, that URL was included with the advertisement for this webinar. Are there any questions from the audience here with me in the room? Sure, come up so we can hear the question. Yeah.
Question on zoning on small area, urban areas. Have maybe a crop on it for the time being, or a cover crop, but zoned heavy industrial. Just wondered how you would go about discussing a evaluation on that.
If everybody heard the question, the issue is the land that's zoned heavy industrial but may have some sort of crop on it. Typically, that land would not be subject to FPPA because it would fall under the already converted or slated for urban development. It would fall under that. It would fall under that exemption. So typically, you wouldn't, particularly if it's adjacent to or within an existing urban area. If it's already zoned for heavy industry, there's an exception in there that's land land designated for urban development, and that pretty much covers those sorts of situations. So.
That's a question for Mabel. Someone's written in, do we need to notify Maxine anyway?
Maxine, I will notify Maxine, and we are kind of like in a different situation right now here at NHQ. We're in the process of actually selecting a new program manager. So I don't know when that's going to be public. I mean, the announcement of the new one, hopefully within the next few weeks. But yeah, I think you should inform Maxine. If you want to CC Maxine, at least before October 31 and send the CPA2 to me, that's fine. If you don't CC her, it's also fine.
Okay. Our next question is, in what circumstances would NRCS need to fill out a 1006 form if activities related to existing farms are exempt? Does NRCS ever need to submit the form?
Yeah, thanks for the question. Never say never, but we were racking our brain when I was preparing my talk tomorrow for the field folks. We were racking our brain for a situation for when NRCS would have to submit a 1006, and we couldn't come up with one. I'd suspect if we got enough people together and thought long and hard enough, we could probably come up with a situation or two, but it's going to be one of those once-in-a-blue moon things.
All
Note that FPPA is included on the CPA-52 as a consideration that planners are supposed to consider when they're looking at conservation practices, farm bill programs, etc. So for conservation planning.
All right. Our next question is on Part 2. How do we calculate farmable land in government jurisdiction and amount of farmland as defined in FPPA? And can you email these slides to us or make them available on the website? I'll answer that second part. Yes, the PowerPoint will be loaded along, and made available with the recording.
Sean, can I add to it? I will coordinate with Sean having that available on the FPPA main website as well, so we'll keep you posted.
Okay, back to your other question of how do we calculate farmable land in government jurisdiction and amount of farmland as defined in FPPA. Yeah, this is something that may already have been done, so first off, look around and see if you got it already. If you don't have it already, then typically farmable land would be land in, oftentimes people use land capability class. So that'd be land capability class 1, 2, 3, or 4. There are other, people use other jurisdictions for other designations for farmable land. The big thing is it's not urban and not designated for urban development. Urban areas, the census tract maps, the urban boundaries from the U.S. Census are explicitly mentioned in the Act as a source of land that is not subject to FPPA. Current urban land use maps, it's something we'd be happy to help you with if you have a specific question about your particular jurisdiction. Again, this is not a one-answer sort of question. This is a making a best professional judgment based on your local experience, consulting. You'd want to consult if this is an area if you're a state-level person and it's an area with which you're not familiar, a county, you'd want to consult with that district conservationist. Make sure you're using the latest data, that sort of thing. So sorry for the bit of a fuzzy answer, but it's again, you want to make it, the key point being once you make that determination, you're consistent. So if you're say you're a new FPPA contact, you're developing this for your state, you'll want to develop these numbers and then keep them on file so that you're using the same numbers. So that for a certain request, you're comparing apples to apples. You're not changing your numbers based on every request that comes in. You'd want to update urban areas on some sort of regular basis, probably every 10 years with the census is when you'd update the amount of urban and drop out land that is no longer subject to FPPA.
All right, tying in with urban areas, our next question is about the U.S. Census Bureau maps use urban areas and urban clusters. Can urban clusters be used as exemption?
I would think that urban clusters would probably fall under. I'm not quite familiar with that term, but just based on kind of an intuitive sense of what it probably means, I suspect that falls under that land already committed to urban development. If you remember on slide 10, I mentioned 3 types of land that are exempt. The already developed stuff, the already committed to urban development and committed to water storage, that second category, already committed to urban development, is, I suspect, where those urban clusters would lie.
Our next question has to do with the kinds of important farmlands that show up on the web soil survey maps. And I think that prime, unique, and statewide soils show up on web soil survey maps. But what about locally important farmland?
State and locally important farmlands sometimes show up and sometimes don't. How's that for a nebulous answer? Basically, it's populated for some states and it's not for other states. I'll pick on my home state of Hawaii as an example of where it is not populated. The reason it's not populated in Hawaii is that ag lands of importance to the state of Hawaii, which is the statewide important farmland list, is not based on soil map units. The boundaries are different than soil map units, so it can't be populated in the soils database because it doesn't correspond exactly. Many states did associate statewide and locally important farmland with existing map units. Sometimes that information is populated in the database, sometimes it's not. It does, however, need to be in the EFOTG. That's why the official source of that information is the EFOTG.
Our next question, just verifying that Section C of the CPA2 does not necessarily have to be completed. Otherwise, CPA2 report would usually indicate no prime farmland conversion, correct?
Correct. If you leave it blank, that means you don't have any information on any conversion.
Well, that comes back to, just to clarify, and we mentioned this earlier, in theory, that you send the form back to the federal agency or their representative, they're supposed to tell us what happened. Because that form, the form you get as an NRCS contact is a proposal for development. They're supposed to make a decision, fill out parts 6 and 7, and then tell us what happened. We get very, very few of those back. I'm looking at the Nebraska contact here, and what would your guess be? 10%? Even? Hardly any. So just for those of you who get hardly any back. And so what Mabel is saying and what the decision's been made is that we cannot get reliable numbers for the acres converted because we don't know if they did what they proposed or not. So all we can really honestly report to Congress is the acres proposed. That's the rationale.
And to add to Mike, I know a few weeks back someone asked me for actual farmland conversions for their state. So again, the only information that we could provide you are the proposed conversions. Those are the numbers that we could provide you at least 10 years back for your state. That's it.
All right, our next question is for Bob. Should crop index yields always be normalized where the top index in a survey area or county is equal to 100? And question also is, should it be normalized by county rather than survey area?
Well, if you look at the 1006, it's based on 100 points. So I would say the index really got to go up to 100. And it's the question of whether you want to look at a county or a soil survey area. Money flows through counties, not soil survey areas. I would think that counties would be the ones that go with that. And I didn't try web soil survey on a multi-county or a fragmented county areas. It'll be interesting to see how that works if you get a county that's chopped into 4 or 5 different soil survey areas in terms of soil survey areas. Set county is an area of interest in web soil survey. What happens there? I didn't think to try that until just now. So that'll be an interesting project for somebody to engage in.
Keep in mind, it is possible to have a statewide land evaluation system. It's not recommended, and maybe for the smaller states, but there are statewide land evaluation systems out there. In general, you want to use the most localized one, but if you don't have a local one, using a state one is better than none. So,
another question for Bob. What can be done to keep crop yields in NASS? SDJR has removed some of our crop yields. And I don't know if you want to include in that, maybe a comment about the transactional nature of the database versus official data in.
Well, if you want to keep crop yields in NASS, I think if you were to project about $10 million more a year, probably do it. Since that's not going to happen, I think that it's just not going to happen. It's a sad fact and a painful reality. I don't think that we have the staff to update or to maintain those yields. I mean, they're probably at least like a 5-year refresh cycle of crop yields. And the amount of study it would take, some soil aids and stuff like that, or it would be a pretty big undertaking to keep those updated. It's a shame that we can't. It's a real shame. And don't get me started how NASS won't play nice, but they won't play nice. It would be much easier if we could get a hold of that data. Maybe we could get back to Congress. I don't know. I've been thinking of joining them and stealing the data like that Snowden fellow.
you didn't. Nobody heard that. But the issue of crop yields in NASS was a decision made. Basically, we were losing the race with the hybrids, and it was becoming just fiscally untenable to try to keep up nationwide with the changing crop yields. The decision was made at the national level to go with an index. That would lead to the development of the National Commodity Crop Productivity Index, the NCCPI, now in its second version. That will be available with the new data refresh for the entire country coming in January. There's another question here about where should you keep crop yields. If you do want to keep local crop yields, and that could be a valuable thing to do, the EFOTG would be a fine place to do that. And yeah, that's what we, it's just the balance between national and local needs and resources and everything else is just, we just can't play that crop yield race anymore at the national level. The breeders are too good. That's what it amounts to.
So our next one is more of a comment than a question that says, can you please format the form so that it fits on one sheet? It takes 2 pages for the field and is an odd size. It is locked so they cannot resize it. It won't fit on an 8.5 by 14 sheet. And they get complaints every year. Apparently they ask the counties to each fill in their own county info.
Oh. I guess I'm a little confused by the question. I assume the form you're referring to is the 80-1006 and the NRCS CPA 106. I believe both of those are 8.5 by 11 forms. If they're not, yes, we definitely contact Mabel with the specific form you're using. You may have an older version, but if you do have a current version, yeah, we'll work with you to change that. That's news to me. And the CPA2 is just a problem. What Mabel has done now is made this into an Excel spreadsheet, so in theory you don't have to print anything, and you can just share that spreadsheet around and type it in, and it'll sum it up all by itself. And if that's the issue, yeah, then that was the goal with going to an Excel spreadsheet, so we can quit passing paper copies around. Again, you'll let Mabel or I know if there are issues, and we'll get you what you need to get the job done.
And another comment about an application FPPA that they are doing them for conservation innovation grants.
I suppose. Again, I'm not quite sure what I would. I'm blanking on what might result in irreversible conversion of farmland. But like I say, there's got to be an example out there someplace. It's just hard to find something that you'd be doing under an innovation grant that wouldn't support an existing agricultural operation and result in irreversible conversion of farmland. But like I say, never say never.
You may have already alluded to this, but basically the question is about Kales. Is it ever coming back or some other substitute software?
Yeah, the issue of Kales. No, the short answer is no. The longer answer is that we haven't had the demand. We can certainly, Henry Ferguson is here in the room. Henry and I have had this discussion before. Kales itself is not coming back due to its old software. It was run by University of Illinois. They're not going to support it. I mean, there's a whole bunch of long history that you don't need to bore you with. Could something be developed to automate the process that Bob has described today, developing land evaluation system? Probably. But again, when we look at this from the national level and developing a national tool, we go right back to how many people are using it. And, unfortunately, these days of tight budgets and tight staffing, a basic cost-benefit ratio, if there's a lot of demand, something can certainly develop for something here, something there, something here, something there, spread over the next 12 months. And that's kind of been how it's coming over the past couple of years since I've been involved. There hasn't been that driver there to develop something.
And this is a follow-up. Unfortunately, I didn't catch this earlier, but please repeat what was just said about Section C. Do we fill it out, leave it blank, and how does that affect the stuff below?
Okay, you want to give another shot about?
Okay, so for the purposes of the FPPA annual report, you don't need to fill it out. It's a nice to have if you have information about it, but if you don't have any data available, leave it blank. Or if you want to make your life easier, leave it blank. How about that for an answer? So there's no strict mandate to fill that out because the figures from Section C does not appear in the report. As what Mike said earlier, historically, federal agencies do not come back to NRCS and provide the final decisions on the projects that they are funding. And it's going to be one of those extraordinary circumstances if they come back to you. So I guess the final answer is you don't need to fill it out. Is that correct, Mike?
Yes. Basically, it comes down to if we could get reliable data on what was actually converted, that'd be great. We've been at this for 20 years, nearly 20, almost 30 years now. The 85 was when the rule, so this is 27 years now. We haven't gotten reliable data for that yet, and we've pretty much thrown up our hands, and we don't want to report bogus numbers to Congress, and so we tell Congress what we've got, which is we've got proposed. We don't have actual, and that's just what it is.
So to summarize that, on the CPA2, you just fill out sections A, B, and D. Is that right?
Correct. Those are the most important sections that they have to fill out for CPA2. The rest, they can choose not to fill them out.
Now, I've got a question here. So suppose you're new to FPPA with all the changes in staff and whatnot. So where do you go to find the LESA you should use to evaluate a parcel?
You look on the bookshelf of the person who was your predecessor. That's where I found it. I found the binder on the bookshelf. I'm not meaning to be facetious, and I'm looking. Dan Sherliff, who's the assistant here in Nebraska, is nodding across the from across the room here in Lincoln. I hate to be flippant, and please don't take that for for being. But it is hard. There may be odds are there is a land evaluation system has been developed. We've been at this for more than 25 years. Odds are there is an existing land evaluation system. Where it is, it could be in a file someplace. It could be on a bookshelf. It could be in a binder. That's a trick, and I don't have any. There is no official place where it exists, and that's a. Dan is raising his hand here. Dan is, having been there and done that, has a suggestion. I'm all ears.
When I came into South Dakota, there was no binder that had all the information I needed to fill it out. And it was numbers that someone had developed. I will say that when I was there, I updated it once with new ag census data for land and farms. And that I only did that for counties where we had a bunch of urban development. Otherwise, I left it the way it was. And when I came here and looked on Nebraska's shelf, we got a binder that has those numbers in it. And so they were put together on a state-by-state basis. And so it's wherever your state has their FPPA information. And it may be in a paper folder somewhere under, what was the old file code? 430 Farmland Protection.
Yeah, or it might be under 310 as well.
Right.
And I noticed we have a comment from someone who says that it should be loaded into the EFOTG. That's the wonderful situation. Yes, if it's in your EFOTG, pat yourself or your predecessor on the back. Unfortunately, I fear that's the exception, not the rule. Keep in mind, it's the LE that is the rating. The site assessment is done on a project basis. There may be a state site assessment system different from the national one that's spelled out in the rule and found in the handbook. But the site assessment for the purposes of a project is an individual thing. You assess the site that project is slated to be on. So LE values are, for a county, a site assessment depends on where on the specific site involved. LESA is often referred to together, and in some ways I think that's kind of a misnomer. They really are, LE and SA are really two separate things, and you can kind of get yourself crosswise by mixing them up.
And okay, just as a wrap-up comment then, our last one. Mike, your PowerPoint FPA is the best they've ever seen. It needs to be provided as a resource. I'll work with Mabel to post it or link it to the FPPA site, and as well we'll have it posted along with the webinar recording.
I'd just like to make one thanks to whoever said that, much appreciated. Also, I'd just like to echo what Mabel said. We are in a bit of a transition here in the Soil Science Division, but that doesn't mean there isn't support out there. In the meantime, and things are a bit in flux, but in the meantime, if you have questions, please don't hesitate to contact Mabel or to contact me. Our contact information is that we're both in the email. Look us up on the directories, and we'll try to answer any questions you have. There are a lot of screwy situations out there that people don't deal with much, and that's what we're here for, and we'll try to get you an answer, and if we don't know off the top of our head, we'll track it down. So don't hesitate to ask. You have national support. You're not out there on your own. We know this is a collateral duty for a lot of folks. It's an added, you just got voluntold, as a friend of mine said once, that, so don't worry, so you're not out there by yourself. We can help you out. And if you couldn't hear Bob over there across the room, Bob just reiterated that and said he'd be happy to work with folks if they have land evaluation issues about getting the best information. If you're trying to update your land evaluation system, as Dan mentioned that he did a few years ago for South Dakota, or if you're you can't find that binder and you're pulling something together from scratch.
All right. Well, that's going to conclude today's presentation. I thank everyone for your participation, and we'll catch you next time.